In this video, we're going to go through the divisions of the nervous system, starting with the peripheral nervous system and then walking through the different areas of the central nervous system. So the division of labor here is that the central nervous system processes and stores information, while the peripheral nervous system acts more as the input and output, connecting the central nervous system to the rest of the body. In the central nervous system, we have the brain and the spinal cord. So you can think of our nervous system as a whole bunch of pairs. There's the pair of the central and peripheral nervous system. Within the central nervous system, we have the pair of brain and spinal cord. In the peripheral nervous system, we also have a pair of somatic and autonomic, or you could think of a pair of sensory and motor. The brain is more involved with the processing and storage of information, but a little bit of processing goes on in the spinal cord. Mostly the spinal cord acts as a relay, though, between the brain and then the peripheral nervous system there. The peripheral nervous system is made up of mostly nerve fibers, although there are bundles of neurons that live throughout the body. We call those collections of neurons glia. Now, when we look at nervous tissue, we find different types of appearances. There's the gray matter, which in the cortex, or in the forebrain up here, the gray matter is on the outside. When we move down into the brain stem, the gray matter is kind of distributed within the white matter. They sort of mix together. And then down in the spinal cord, the white matter is all on the outside, while the gray matter is on the inside. And in each of these locations, we also have open spaces that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. That would be our ventricular system up in the forebrain, and then the central canal running through the spinal cord. White matter is white because it contains a collection of myelinated axons, and that myelin is mostly fat. Fat is white. Gray matter is where we find the cell bodies and dendrites and synapses for the most part. So since the spinal cord is mostly a relay, you can see it contains an awful lot of white matter, and that's on the outside, allowing axons to enter and exit the spinal cord without having to pass through the gray matter that exists in the spinal cord. The nerves that come off of the central nervous system either arise from the brain stem, those would be the cranial nerves, or from the spinal cord. Those are the spinal nerves. We have 12 cranial nerves, which we will give their own time. Most of them come off of the brainstem, with two exceptions, cranial nerves 1 and 2. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. That's a very short nerve that runs from the olfactory epithelium straight up to the olfactory bulb. It's the shortest cranial nerve. Cranial nerve 2 is the ocular nerve. The optic nerve. What's wrong with me? The optic nerve, which arises from the retina and runs back to the thalamus. Cranial nerves 3 through 12 arise from the brainstem. Cranial nerve 11 also arises from the spinal cord, though, so it's kind of a weird one. We'll talk more about that later. The cranial nerves, as you might imagine, innervate the face. Cranial nerve 10 also innervates the viscera, so that'll hit our lungs, heart, GI tract as well. And cranial nerve 11 innervates the shoulder and neck. The rest of the body is handled by the spinal nerves. Rather than arising from the brain stem, the spinal nerves arise from the spinal cord. This is a cross-section through the spinal cord. These spinal nerves exit through these spaces between the vertebrae, called the intervertebral foramen. Going from top to bottom, we find spinal nerves emerging at every segment of the spine, but the spinal cord doesn't run all the way down. In fact, the spinal cord ends somewhere around the first and second lumbar level. So at L2 or 3 and below, we no longer have the spinal cord. Instead, we have the cauda equina. So what does this look like? What in the world is going on here? Okay, that was cool. Alright, what is going on? Okay. Little technology issue, tons of fun. Okay, so brain, spinal cord. Alright, not drawn to scale or anything. At the bottom of the spinal cord, it's just a series of nerve roots that run down, and they'll exit at different segments to innervate the rest of the body. So at L2 and below, we have just a bunch of nerve fibers called the cauda equina, or the horse's tail. I guess that's kind of what it looks like. This is nice because here we don't have spinal cord anymore. So if you need to do something like a lumbar puncture, there's a reason that we go into the lumbar spine there. So we can draw up cerebral spinal fluid. If we were to jab a needle up above there, we'd hit the spinal cord and damage it. If we damage the central nervous system, we form a glial scar, and then the axons can't re-innervate that area. By puncturing below in the lumbar spine, we avoid the spinal cord, and instead we're dealing more with spinal roots. So we're essentially down in the peripheral nervous system at that point. So we're hitting a big fluid-filled cavity. Sure, it has nerve fibers running in there, but it's not the spinal cord. And the nerve fibers that come off follow the top to bottom organization of our body pretty well. And that's why we have this sort of orderly arrangement of dermatomes. I say sort of because we're bipeds, so it doesn't work for us too well. But let's appreciate just a few major landmarks, like the arm, for example. Of course, this is going to include C5 down to T1, a little bit of T2 as well, but the roots that create the brachial plexus, of course, those innervate the arm, and it kind of makes sense, right? C5 is next to C6, C7 hits the third digit here, and we're at C8 and back up to T1. This makes a whole lot more sense if we don't think about bipeds like you and I, but instead think about quadrupeds. Most animals walk around on 4 legs, unlike us, so we're special. We walk around on 2 legs, and we can use our other 2 limbs to do nifty stuff. But other animals, like whatever this is going to end up being, something between a cat and a dog, they walk around on 4 limbs. So let's have a look at those dermatomes of the leg. So we got L2, L3, L4, and 5. We're going down the front here, and this kind of makes sense. If we look at the back, L2 is next to S2. That's kind of weird. But that's because we're wrapping around the leg here, thinking about being a quadruped. It's not top to bottom, it's head to tail. Same thing for our upper limbs too. So we have to take this 3-dimensional structure that is our body and organize it into a line, because that's what our spinal cord is. It's a big old line sitting down there under the brain. So we have to take essentially a 2-dimensional object and use it to map a 3-dimensional object. So we do the best we can, but you'll notice we wrap around the front of the leg, and then eventually we're going to terminate back here at the anus. And that's where we terminate. So that last coccygeal segment hits the anus. Within the spinal cord, we have neurons that live within it. The motor neurons live in the anterior horn. You might think that the dorsal horn contains the sensory neurons, but it doesn't. This contains relay neurons. They do deal with sensory information, but the primary sensory neurons live outside in the dorsal root ganglion, not in the spinal cord, but in the root. We also have the lateral horn. This is where, if they are present, autonomic neurons live, the preganglionic autonomic neurons. Now, they're not found at every spinal segment. The sympathetic neurons are found from T1 down to about L3 or so. And then the parasympathetic neurons are found in the brainstem, scattered throughout, starting in the midbrain, down in the pons and medulla as well. And then they're found down there at the bottom at sacral sections 2 through 4. So it's kind of like a sandwich. The meat and cheese would be the sympathetic nervous system, and the bread is the parasympathetic nervous system, with the preganglionic neurons arising from the brainstem and the sacral spinal cord. Now you'll notice we have yet another pair. We have preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. Preganglionic neurons live in the central nervous system. Postganglionic neurons live somewhere else. For sympathetic neurons, most of them are in the paravertebral ganglia, that sympathetic chain ganglia that lives right next to the spinal cord. There are 4 prevertebral ganglia scattered throughout the body, so not every postganglionic neuron lives in the sympathetic chain. For the parasympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neurons all live at or very close to the target tissues. In fact, in the GI tract, the postganglionic neurons live within the GI tract. At the heart, they live kind of on it, but in the GI tract, they live in it. So, very long preganglionic axons for the parasympathetic division, very short preganglionic axons in the sympathetic division. And these two components work together, acting as the gas and the brake. For example, at the heart, sympathetic innervation increases heart rate, parasympathetic innervation decreases heart rate. This allows us to have a proper regulation of heart rate, movement through the GI tract. Well, in this case, sympathetic innervation decreases movement through the GI tract. So rather than increasing movement like we see in the heart, we're decreasing it. So that acts as the brake. The gas in this case arises from cranial nerve 10. So parasympathetic input stimulates peristalsis in the GI tract. So nearly everything in our body gets dual innervation. Not quite everything, right? Our sweat glands are only going to get input from the sympathetic nervous system, for example. But most things get dual innervation. All right, let's go through the brain in a little more detail here, highlighting the different functional regions. And in general, the higher you are in the brain, the more complex the task is. So location is everything. Depending on where we have brain damage, that's going to determine the symptoms. The cerebral cortex is where the magic happens, and that magic is life. So all of your conscious awareness arises from the cortex, mostly from the frontal lobes, if I had to just pick one. This is where we probably put everything together, and this constructs who we are, and this is where we create our plans. The other lobes have different functions. So for frontal lobes, we want to think behavior. So motor output. The motor cortex, for example, is found in the frontal lobes. In the prefrontal cortex, this is largely just an association region where we're combining all the information from other lobes, such as visual input from the occipital lobe, somatosensory and spatial information from the parietal lobes, auditory, memory, and emotional information from the temporal lobes. All that comes together in the frontal lobes so that we have a unified experience of now. You don't really see your vision and your hearing as two separate things happening separately. They come together. When you're watching someone talk, you don't think of them moving their mouth and the sounds that they're making as being two separate things. They are one and the same. They all get put together in the frontal lobes. Now, buried beneath here, we've got the thalamus and the brainstem. All right, shown right here. The thalamus is this big old hunk of tissue sitting on top of the brainstem. This is grand central station. If you want to make it into the cortex, you got to go through the thalamus. Below there, we have the midbrain, pons, medulla. Sitting on back here, which has been cut off unfairly, but here it is up here. There's the cerebellum. The cerebellum is critical for proper coordination of movements. When we have damage in the cerebellum, we have ataxia, or uncoordinated movements. In the pons, this also deals with coordination, but more with coordinating activity in the medulla. The activity in the medulla is all vital functions: breathing, swallowing, cardiopulmonary function. That's all controlled there. And you'll notice a lot of those things involve the same parts of the body, like the throat. So if we're going to choose to breathe, well, we need to make sure that we're not also trying to drink something at the same time. So the pons helps regulate activity in the medulla. It has its own stuff going on too. There's a lot of important sensory nuclei there for the face. We also have the facial nucleus there, so we can have motor output to control the face. And then the brainstem there. This is between the lower parts of the brainstem and the cortex. So the midbrain contains all the fibers that help wake our cortex up that arise from the brainstem. So when we have damage in the midbrain, it's not uncommon to experience coma because the ascending arousal system is damaged. Also in the midbrain, we have neurons that control the eyes. All right, let's start in the cortex and work our way down. So the cortex is not some homogeneous mass. We have functional zones such as the primary motor cortex, but this doesn't act on its own. There's a number of motor regions such as the supplementary motor area or the premotor cortex running down here that work together with the primary motor cortex to control motor output. The primary motor cortex is called that because that's all it deals with, just movements. It doesn't take into account other information. That's what we get with association cortices, where we might plan multiple actions together, not just the one action we're trying to carry out, or we might consider the location of an object so that we can properly reach out and grasp it. So in association regions, we're going to deal with more than one bit of information. The primary visual cortex only deals with vision, and that's it, just the nitty-gritty, itsy-bitsy details. What's the angle of the line? What color is it? When we move outside of the primary visual cortex, this is where we start to put a little more information together. Have I encountered this shape and this color before with a squiggly letter in there? And I'm trying to describe a stop sign to you. What's my memory of a stop sign? Oh, I should stop my car. Well, that's going to happen over here when we enter the temporal lobes. That's where memory lives. Where is the stop sign? We're going to go up to the parietal lobes. Oh, it's in front of me. We need to go into the parietal lobes because the parietal lobes have the primary somatosensory cortex. This is our body map. So where are we? Where is the stuff I'm looking at? When we meet in the middle, this is where we start to put stuff in the world. The way that we know where stuff is by remembering where it is relative to us. I know that the computer is in front of me. Everything is always relative to me. So, as we're moving between these primary cortical areas, we're essentially merging their functions. We'll get a kind of a better idea of what these different parts of the cortex do whenever we see damage to them. So we'll start off in the frontal lobes. Remember, when we think frontal lobes, we should be thinking behavior.
Becky and Jerry Harper couple were on the verge of divorce after 18 years of marriage.
Like walking on eggshells, because you never knew what was going to set him off. And it was like, no, I'm not living this way.
No one had a clue what was behind Jerry's personality change, from someone who was kind and laid back to someone who snapped at anything.
I was getting more upset with the guys at work. You know, I'm usually pretty easygoing at work, and I was, you know, taking a lot of stuff out on them too.
Here, what you see is this area of whiteness.
Until one day when Jerry collapsed and doctors found out he had a non-cancerous brain tumor the size of a plum pressing against his frontal lobe.
The best analogy that you can draw to it is someone who's been at the bar a little bit too long and is a little bit free with their speech.
You just thought he was being a jerk.
Just pretty much, yeah. Yeah, pretty much.
One day, Jerry realized something wasn't right.
I mean, I have never laid a hand on her, and one time I raised my hand at her, and...
That was not you.
No, that wasn't me.
This is where the tumor used to live, but...
Dr. McGowan removed Jerry's tumor, and things have gotten back to normal.
He has some residual, some memory problems that he doesn't like to admit to. He still snaps every once in a while.
Pretty much mellowed out. You know, have a lot better relationship with my wife. The kids don't upset me as easily as they used to. The hamburger meat's in the refrigerator.
But if Jerry hadn't collapsed and had that brain scan, they might have never known what was erratic behavior.
If there's changes and they're gradual, and it's not, you know, their normal personality, definitely get it checked out.
Chronically criminal behavior.
Dr. McGowan says some people don't find out until it's too late and their lives spiral out of control, losing their families, jobs, and even ending up in jail.
So when we think frontal lobes, we need to think behavior. In this case, you'll notice it's pretty far toward the front. Oh, probably somewhere in about this region. Now, a little further back, this is where we have the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex contains the upper motor neurons. Now, if we were to have damage here, we'd see a change in behavior, but that would be due to weakness and paralysis. A little further up in those association regions, here we see a change in behavior, not because of weakness or paralysis or anything, but because of a change in thinking. It makes sense that kids would irritate him. I totally get where he's coming from there, but snapping at people and you know, threatening violence, clearly this is not acceptable. And he realized this is out of the norm. That's not what his behavior should be. And that's because he had a tumor pressing in his frontal lobes and changing his personality. So up here, right in the front, this is where you live, by the way. So if we had a map, oh my God, what's going on? There we go. You are here. You're in your frontal lobe. So when we have damage in the frontal lobes, our personalities change. Now, on the back of the brain, of course, if you were going to hook your eyes up to any part of the brain, the eyes are all around here or so. What is going on? My goodness. Okay, we're back, at least for now. Of course, where you'd want to send them to is right back here, the furthest away that you could go. And that's what we do. It's a little more convoluted path than what I drew there, but in the back, in the occipital lobes, this is where we deal with vision. Back of the head is where we deal with the stuff from the front of the head. And we're on parietal lobes. If I would use my occipital lobe to read, that would help a whole lot. Okay, so we're over here in the parietal lobes. Now remember, we have our body map here. Here's my primary somatosensory cortex. Between here and the occipital lobes, this is where we put stuff together, where we localize stuff in space. So when we have damage in the parietal lobes, one of the things that we often see are visual spatial deficits. This is a common task called a clock drawing task. everyone knows what a clock looks like. So it's fairly easy to tell if someone's doing it correctly. This, we're seeing an example of hemi neglect. So we have damage on the right parietal lobes. The left side of the world gets neglected as a result. You'll notice this clock doesn't look standard. The left side, notice how it's being neglected here. So we're going to go ahead and just jump up. Now we're just going to leave out that whole area of the clock, even though they've gone ahead and given her the circle to start with. And there you can see she only drew the 2 of the 12. So clearly she didn't get the clock right. Now, not that I'm showing off or anything, but we can all, I think, handle the clock drawing task, right? We should be able to arrange the numbers, and we can tell if we have any sort of neglect because one part of the clock is going to be missing something, and it's almost always the left. Damage on the left side in the parietal lobes tends to affect language. On the right side of the parietal lobes, that's where we put stuff together. So language is as important to us as everything else in the world. In the parietal lobes, there's certainly some language function. That's mostly in the temporal lobes. But the parietal lobes also play a role. Damage on the right side creates that neglect that we see here. All right, we're finally in the occipital lobes. And here we're going to see visual deficits.
Right side, and my friend Mary and Jamie were demonstrating, and they were across the other side of the road, and I saw him, and I saw one of Jamie going up in the air and back down again. And buses going up and down, and there was no buses. I know that there's nothing there, but I'm saying there's nothing there. It's not real. Buses come along. If I'm standing with...
All right, a little hard to understand because of the accent, but this is an example of Charles Bonnet syndrome. Charles Bonnet syndrome was, of course, described by Charles Bonnet. I don't know when. This was a long time ago, 19th century. And this arises whenever there's damage in the visual pathways. Now, more commonly, it's because of some sort of retinal degeneration or something like that. And whenever we deprive the occipital lobes of visual input, well, these neurons are just going to make stuff up. Charles Bonnet syndrome can also arise, though, from damage in the primary visual cortex. Because, remember, we still have association cortices. They're still alive, so they're still going to create visual perceptions. But they're not based on the real world. If you'll watch the video here, well, you know what, I guess we can finish it. Why not?
A bus stop, and I'm looking for a bus coming along the road. There's maybe no bus coming, but I can see buses coming out of streets that don't come out of streets. Buses going up in the air. It's just because I'm maybe concentrating and looking for a bus.
That's the line. So whenever she's looking for something, she'll see a hallucination of it. And the hallucinations with Charles Bonnet syndrome are usually very detailed, usually very colorful. There's often a lot of movement in it, and they're not unpleasant. People usually enjoy these. It's not such a bad thing. And they have good awareness. They have good awareness because we're not dealing with damage up. Oh my God. I wish I could deal with some damage right now. What is going on? What is this? Oh, cool. Cool. All right. All right. So this is not working out too well. So let's think back with the frontal lobe. Remember, his wife said he has some memory impairments that he won't admit to. Well, it might be that he's not admitting to it. It might also be that he's just not aware of them. That's the other option. So a lack of awareness of deficits often occurs with frontal lobe damage. So when we have damage in the visual cortex and we start hallucinating, we are aware that there's a problem. So here we can see an example in the upper right here. This is an example of someone who has Charles Bonnet syndrome because of damage back in the occipital lobes. So occipital lobes, think vision. Now, in the temporal lobes, also a bit in the frontal lobes there, these are very important areas for the creation of language. So there's two regions, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is over here in the frontal lobes. That's where we will create sounds in order to stimulate the motor neurons necessary to create the sounds. Of course, that's going to be frontal lobes. Now, making sense of the sounds, well, that's back here in the parietal lobes. That's Wernicke's area. So, did I say parietal? In the temporal lobes, that's where Wernicke's area is. So in the temporal lobes, we should be thinking, here's our temporal lobes, by the way. I guess I could label these. In the temporal lobes, we should think sound, memory, and emotion. Those are the big functions of the temporal lobes. So we'll deal with the sound aspect of it here. We have damage in Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobes. We have broken speech production.
Now tell me what this thing was with your legs last week or week before.
No good.
All right, I think we get the point there. So he's having a hard time making sounds. And I think the first Broca's patient, I think the quote is ta 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 ta, something like that. They have difficulty producing speech. Wernicke's area, this is where we understand sound. This is where we ascribe meaning to words. So when we have damage in Wernicke's area, we get wacky speech production. Let's see an example of that.
Boom.
What's this?
The big end right there. End of the football.
End of the football?
It influences the football right here. It causes it comes in, see?
Yeah.
The end of it, see? Whoa, we got a lot of things, see?
So he's clearly able to make sounds, they just don't make a whole lot of sense. These two areas, Broca's and Wernicke's area, are linked together by a little fiber bundle called the arcuate fasciculus. So these are always communicating with each other so that these sounds that we make have appropriate meaning. Damage in either one of these or the bundle of fibers that connects them gives us aphasia. Buried deeper in the temporal lobes, we have components of the limbic system. Two areas I want to highlight here, the hippocampus and the amygdala. You can see the hippocampus over here. The amygdala kind of sits on the front. It's almond-shaped, so they called it the amygdala. That's what that means. Hippocampus means seahorse. It kind of looks like a seahorse in a cross-section. Hippocampus is all about memory, semantic memory. So all the facts that you know about all the stuff in life, including you, those are created in your hippocampus. If they're deemed important, they get stored in the cortex. So you can think of hippocampus as short-term memory, if you will, although things stay there for years. And you can think of the cortex as long-term memory. The hippocampus is able to learn stuff quickly, but it also forgets stuff. It takes a long time to achieve mastery and make it to the cortex, but once the information is there, it stays. So your name lives in your cortex. The stuff that you learn in this class will live in the hippocampus. Maybe some will make it to the cortex, but let's be real, probably not a whole lot. The amygdala is all about emotion, and in particular, negative emotion. That's the major function of the amygdala. If the amygdala is active, we have negative affect. It also plays some role in memory. Notice it's right next to the hippocampus, so it can clearly affect memory in that way. This might be why traumatic events are remembered even if we wouldn't want to remember them. So the strong negative emotion that's created in the amygdala also strongly stimulates the hippocampus to encode that memory. Now, why do we think the hippocampus is so important to memory? Well, because it is. The reason that we know it is because of, first and foremost, this gentleman here, Henry Molaison, called patient HM to protect his identity, but he's no longer with us, so I suppose that isn't important. Patient HM suffered from epilepsy, and it's not uncommon for epilepsy to arise from the medial temporal lobes where the hippocampus lives because it's a very excitable region. We'll talk about this more in our epilepsy lecture. But in order to treat his seizures, they removed the hippocampus from both sides of patient HM's brain. This certainly reduced his seizures. Unfortunately, it also completely obliterated his memory. So he worked with Brenda Milner for the rest of his life, but never learned who she was. So he always met her. It was always the first time he was meeting her, every day that they met. He was stuck in the past and couldn't learn anything new. He could learn some motor behaviors, but he couldn't learn any new facts. The amygdala we think is so important for emotional salience, especially negative emotion, because of another special case of brain damage. In this case, rather than surgical damage, this is caused by a genetic abnormality where the amygdala on both sides of the brain degenerated. So we can see the arrows down here. There's a big gaping hole where the amygdala should be. This is not patient HM, this is patient SM. This is a normal control. Oh, this is just further up showing you the hippocampus. I'm sorry, further back showing the hippocampus. When we move up more anteriorly to where the amygdala should be, it's gone. Patient SM was discovered because she was repeatedly assaulted. She wasn't able to tell when situations were dangerous. She wasn't able to tell when people were threatening. She couldn't recognize that negative emotion in them. So she'd walk through bad neighborhoods, and after multiple assaults, they did some brain imaging and found that she lacked an amygdala. Buried further down in the cortex, right? This is below the cortex, so we're outside of it now. Here's our medial temporal lobes. So here we're looking at the amygdala right here. Here's the cortex. Now they've done a myelin stain, so the white matter is black. So it's darker than the gray matter in this case. So here's the cortex. Buried below there we have the basal ganglia. This is the thalamus here, we'll get to in just a little bit. We've got the caudate and putamen. Collectively they're called the striatum. We've got this kind of paler region called the pale globe or the globus pallidus. There's a subthalamic nucleus that lives below the thalamus. Name makes sense. There's also something called the black substance or the substantia nigra. And collectively, these nuclei comprise the basal ganglia. And the purpose of the basal ganglia is to allow for appropriate action selection. And when we have damage to the basal ganglia, we see one of two problems. One thing that might happen is that we're unable to execute actions swiftly or at all. And that's what occurs in Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, the loss of dopamine neurons makes it difficult for us to execute action. So here you can see this gentleman is struggling to stand up. Eventually he does. We can see the resting tremor that's characteristic of Parkinson's disease. A little more pronounced on the right than the left. Notice the shuffling gait, very small steps. So he wants to take a step, but he can't properly execute that movement. So all he gets is a little shuffling movement. On the other hand, damage in the basal ganglia can cause an excess of movement. Here we see Hemi Bolismus. Now she doesn't want to move. These movements are all involuntary and I suppose painful, as she describes it. So damage in the basal ganglia can make it hard to execute action, or it can cause us to move in an uncontrolled manner. And that's because there's two different pathways, at least, that run through the basal ganglia that do different things. Alrighty, now we're moving on down. We're in the thalamus. Grand central station. I want you to think of it as grand central station. All roads to the cortex lead through the thalamus. Very few things go directly to the cortex, only smell. And smell also passes through the thalamus, but it does hit the cortex first. So the cortex and the thalamus are always talking to each other, and this is what your conscious awareness is. All the sensory information goes through the thalamus and then makes it to the cortex. If they can't talk to each other, you don't know what's going on in the world. So part of the way that we go to sleep is by decreasing communication between the thalamus and the cortex. So even though there are still sounds going on, we're not aware of them when we go to sleep. The cortex always talks back to the thalamus too, to keep it awake and to make guesstimates about what we might care letting through the thalamus. So we can have selective attention. We can pay a little less attention to sounds. We can filter those out if we're reading, for example, in a coffee shop. It's not perfect, but it works a little bit, I guess. But for the thalamus, just think of it as grand central station. We got different parts of the thalamus that talk to different parts of the cortex. For example, we'll see how this works out. If we're going to relay information to the back, well, that's going to be parts of the thalamus. Let me put the thalamus here. That are in the back of the thalamus. They go over there. But hey, those that are in the front, guess where they go? Yeah, to the front. So there's a map that kind of makes sense in the thalamus. There's different divisions that talk to different parts of the cortex. So just like we have different functional zones in the cortex, we have different functional zones in the thalamus. But we'll talk about those next semester. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part of the neuroendocrine system, so that we can release hormones to create stress responses or to mature sexually. So the hypothalamus is going to communicate with the pituitary to control hormone release. The hypothalamus also communicates with the spinal cord to control autonomic responses. And then the sleep-wake cycles. We wake up in the morning and get tired at night because of our hypothalamus. Okay, we're finally down there in the brainstem. So the midbrain, we should be thinking eye movements and arousal. That's because of the ascending arousal system that passes through the brainstem. So here, he's not winking. He's just unable to open his right eyelid because he has damage to the third cranial nerve. The oculomotor nerve arises from the midbrain. You can see here he can abduct his eye because the sixth cranial nerve still works, but his right eye can't move up, down, to the left. Off the back of the brainstem, we have the cerebellum. When the cerebellum is damaged, as it is in this gentleman here, you can see impairments in coordination, or ataxia. There's two general types of ataxia. Here we're looking at truncal ataxia, where the trunk, kind of the middle of the body, our sense of balance is thrown off. We also have appendicular ataxia, where the appendages are more affected rather than our sense of balance. But when we have cerebellar damage, coordination is impaired. It doesn't make us weak. It doesn't affect our conscious awareness of what's going on in our body. Instead, damage in the cerebellum affects the ability to coordinate actions. A lot of the movements that we carry out, we don't actually think about. We just think, I want to stand up. And we automatically shift our weight accordingly so we don't fall over. That's all done in the cerebellum. Moving below there, we have the pons and medulla. These, for the most part, work together. The medulla is kind of the workhorse, and the pons is more the manager. So it kind of regulates the functions of the medulla to make sure we don't do two conflicting tasks at the same time, like breathe and take a drink. So the medulla contains the motor neurons that carry out those actions, or whether they be the lower or upper motor neurons. And then the pons contains the interneurons that control those motor neurons in the medulla. When we have damage in the medulla, most often we have life-threatening illnesses. When we have damage in the pons, one of the things that we can see is locked-in syndrome, and here's an example of it.
Mike and Wendy Cubis, and memories of a more normal time. It was a couple of days after this holiday that Mike had a massive stroke. It left him paralysed, unable to talk.
He was 40.
It's very young.
Incredibly young. It was very bleak, really, apart from I had to carry on and the boys kept me going. They were only aged 12, 10 and 8, and I think the eldest one I found it very difficult to cope with.
Mike has locked-in syndrome, but is able to communicate using his eyes.
Black, tail, black.
He looks at letters on a board, and Wendy has become expert at interpreting her husband's thoughts. Given a little more time, Mike can also use a computerized voice system. Can you explain what living with locked-in syndrome?
I'm gonna go ahead and pause it. You can watch this yourself if you're interested. Now you'll notice he can still use his eyes. That should make a whole lot of sense. Remember, when we're thinking eye movements, we're thinking midbrain, and midbrain is above the pons and medulla. Let's get ourselves a little brain stem here. Midbrain, pons, medulla, something like that. Going off the back, we got our cerebellum. So locked-in syndrome arises from damage in the pons. The reason that he can no longer move the rest of his body is because this has severed, I can draw a knot to scale here, the upper motor neurons that are passing through. So all those upper motor neurons, their axons are damaged because of a stroke in the pons, so none of the lower motor neurons down here in the spinal cord get excitatory input anymore. We can't move our body. But we still have innervation here in the midbrain. So this gentleman is still able to move his eyes up, down, left, and right. Because the trochlear and oculomotor nerves still work, so he can move his eyes around pretty well. Depending on where the lesion is, the abducens might still work, so you can completely move your eyes around. Damage down here in the medulla is often fatal. So even though we have damage in the pons, and we're going to have trouble coordinating the activity of the medulla, those neurons are still alive. However, if we have damage within the medulla itself, and we no longer have the motor neurons that control respiratory muscles, we can't breathe. If we can't breathe, we don't live. All right, there's a few questions that you can have a look at. We'll go through these and others in class. If you have any questions, fill out the questions box to let me know what we should review.